This is part 3 for chapter 4, and we will just be covering or basically wrapping up the chapter on chapter 4, which is the public sector. Now, you'll recall that I mentioned in part 2 that the public sector basically refers to the government. We want to know, what role does the government play in a market economy? Now, the government does a lot of different things, and in later chapters we go into great detail about all the different functions of the government. But what I'm wanting you to do is focus on what are the microeconomic functions of government versus the macroeconomic functions of government. So microeconomic functions, there's lots and lots of things the government does, but primarily they correct for what we call market failures, and they also are responsible for redistributing income, which we refer to as transfer payments. So that's all I really need you to focus on for the context of this chapter, is the fact that the government, in terms of microeconomic functions, they correct market failures and they provide transfer payments. So the most common market failure that they correct for would be something that we call externalities. Externalities are a cost or benefit borne by somebody who's not directly involved in a market transaction. So a really good example of like a negative externality would be pollution that is created when somebody purchases gasoline from a gas station and then drives their vehicle. So we can identify that the original market transaction, the buyer and the seller, is the person buying the gas and the seller is the gas station. However, when they get into their car and then drive that vehicle, it creates pollution in the air, which we consider a negative externality. Now people who were not directly involved in that market transaction are having to suffer this negative consequence of breathing in polluted air because of the pollution that was created by the initial market transaction. So again, the government would get involved and impose taxes upon the purchase of gasoline in order to help pay to clean up that pollution. So again, that's just one example of a market failure where the government gets involved. And again, there's several other categories of market failures that we could go into, but I just want you to generally understand that the government does get involved in the market when the market fails. Another thing the government does in terms of microeconomic functions is provide transfer payments. Transfer payments, by definition, is just the government taking money from those that earned it and transferring it to somebody who did not earn it. So in other words, just income is transferred by the government from a citizen who is earning income to another citizen who did not earn that money. So an example of a transfer payment would be a Social Security payment, an unemployment payment, a disability payment, a welfare payment. In other words, people that received those checks from the government did not earn that money, and the government was able to get that money by taxing other people. So think about the paycheck that you get every month. You don't actually get to collect all of the money that you earn. The government taxes it and keeps a portion of your income, and then that allows them to then transfer that money to somebody else. So again, a microeconomic function of government is to provide transfer payments. Now, the macroeconomic functions of government can basically be covered in what we call monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is directed at the control of money and credit, and that is basically conducted by the Federal Reserve in the United States. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is spending and taxation by the government. So the government collects taxes, they get to decide what the tax rates are, and then they have to figure out how they're going to spend it. So fiscal policy is a major component of macroeconomics. Now, in terms of fiscal policy, after the government collects our taxes and then spends it, depending on how much they spend in relation to how much they tax, they're going to have either what we call a budget surplus or a budget deficit. So, if the spending is less than tax receipts, then they are having a budget surplus. Whereas if the government spending is greater than the amount of taxes they collect, then you're having a budget deficit. So again, we can look at data to see what does our budget look like in the United States from a historical perspective. And what we see is that from a historical perspective, the United States it's very common for us to run budget deficits. You'll notice that from about 1976 on, we ran a budget deficit every single year except for a few years when Clinton was in office right here. In other words, Clinton had 4 years of budget surpluses where he spent less than the amount of taxes that were collected, but then every year after that you see that we've had these huge budget deficits, and in recent years the budget deficits have gone into the trillions. In fact, in 1 year alone we spent more than $1.5 trillion than what we had collected in taxes. So every time the country has to borrow money in order to finance its overspending, that increases our national debt. So at this point in time, our national debt in 2015 is around $17 trillion. So again, some people get national debt and budgets confused. A budget is just the year-to-year expenditures that take place, whereas the national debt is the accumulated debt that we've, again, acquired over time. So every time we run a deficit, we add to our national debt. Now the graph here on the right actually gives you a better depiction of the record of U.S. federal budget deficits from 1970s up until the present time. All of those red years indicate all of the years that we were running a federal budget deficit, whereas just the 4 in black, that's going to represent the 4 years that we actually had a budget surplus. So again, you can see in 2009, that was the year that we had a budget deficit of $1.5 trillion. So, we overspent $1.5 trillion in relation to the taxes that we were collecting. But again, I do make sure that you know how to calculate a deficit versus a surplus. You simply take tax receipts minus the amount of expenditures, and if you have a positive number, it means you have a trade surplus, and if you have a negative number, it means you have a deficit.